What Are the Odds by Lindell. From crack addict to CEO. Continued on Chapter 20. Digital Hawk holds and owns no copyrights to the reading of this material is for educational purposes only. Thank you, Mike. Chapter 20. Learning Curve. From the day I first dreamed up the pillow until the day the first batch was ready for sale, time sped by in a blur. When I wasn't working my way through the bankruptcy case or counting cards to pay the mortgage and feed the kids with money borrowed against the contract for deed now owned by Bob, I was working out the details of my pillow. After a long string of bad luck and terrible decisions, I was energized. Darren and I finally hit on the right fill for the pillow, but we couldn't sit on the back deck and tear foam by hand forever. We had to come up with a way to automate. We tried several methods: graters, electric knives, wood chippers, and even a blender, but nothing worked. It was frustrating at times, but I wouldn't trade anything for the time I spent with Darren week after week, sitting outside and talking as we reached for a dream. Then a friend of mine made a suggestion that changed everything. I was discussing my automation problem while playing cards with my regular poker buddies: Wayne Hilk, Lyle Lund, Slip Mahoney, JD, and Joe Wickenhauser. Mike, you used to work on a farm, my friend Joe said. You should try one of them old hammer mills. A hammer mill is used to shred or crush materials into smaller pieces by repeated blows of little hammers or blades. These cutting or crushing tools can be changed out to produce final products of differing sizes. Farmers use hammer mills to crush grain into coarse flour that they can feed to livestock. Hammer mills are also used to grind shipping pallets into mulch and to shred paper, scrap automobile parts, or crush rocks. Joe's comment got my son Charlie involved as he and I drove around the Midwest for weeks looking for a hammer mill. No luck. I was playing cribbage with Lyle one day when, out of the blue, he said, "I seen one of them hammer mills out there on the Olson place." A plain spoken man of German roots, Lyle is an old school Minnesota farmer, right down to his handlebar mustache. I looked at him. "Are you sure?" "I think so." I jumped up from the table. "I gotta go see right now. I'll be back." I sped out to the Olson farm, which was less than 2 miles from my house, to see if Lyle was right. In the middle of a field sat a beat up old hammer mill, with sun rays glinting dully off the rusted metal. Charlie and I had driven across a dozen counties looking for one of these things. What are the odds that I'd find one less than 2 miles from my house? I located Mr. Olson and inquired about his machine. As we headed out into his field to take a closer look, he told me hardly anyone used these old models anymore. Even he didn't, it turned out. As we got closer, I saw that grass covered half the hammer mill and was also growing up through it. It must have been sitting out there for years. Mr. Olson sold me his machine for practically nothing. I got it home and tinkered with it for days, trying different combinations of hammers, knives, and screens until it finally shredded foam in the sizes I needed. This was not without risk. Changing out the screens that determined the ultimate foam size was a dangerous job that cost me a little in blood every now and then. I didn't mind. I had cobbled together a machine that did the job. Speaking of jobs, I didn't have one. My friend Bob was still lending me money against the contract for deed, and I had run through it like water. using the cash to develop the pillow, keep the refrigerator full, and the lights on. I decided to take a break and do some more serious card counting, as I was almost completely out of cash. The Beau Rivage was a towering hotel in Biloxi, Mississippi, overlooking the Gulf of Mexico. Karen and I headed down there to turn $2,000, our remaining spare cash, into a mortgage payment and other monthly expenses. For a little over 24 hours, I sat at the blackjack tables while Karen played slot machines. Accepting what seemed like a gallon of free cocktails, I stuck to my usual act. I hoped I looked to the pit bosses like a good timing drunk, having a lucky run at the cards. But I was actually ticking off Voss's matrices in my head. I counted meticulously until about 3 a.m. when I walked away from the table with more chips than I'd had in a very long time. By the time I cashed them in, the cocktails were catching up with me. Very intoxicated, I stumbled to our room, where Karen was still up drinking herself. Hey, I've got something to show you, I said, my voice half mystery, half excitement. I just won $14,000. It was the largest sum of cash we'd had in a while that didn't belong to somebody else. But that wasn't my biggest news. Vas Spanos had called me that evening. A couple of members of a high end professional card counting team had been watching me play that night, scouting me actually. They planned to invite me to join. The most famous card counting team is portrayed in the movie 21, which tells the story of mathematics professor Mickey Rosa and a group of Massachusetts Institute of Technology students who use their math skills to win big in Vegas. Card counting teams use different strategies. Sometimes a team is just two players, friends maybe, or even a male female team pretending to be a couple. In this kind of team play, one player, usually the better counter, may use signals to indicate how the other should bet. They might roll up their sleeves or move their cocktail from their right to their left. In another version of a two-member team, one player bets big chips and appears to be paying very little attention to the game. In fact, though, this player is counting very accurately and reading signals from the other, who is playing small chips at the same table while pretending to be a stranger. The team Voss was recruiting me for was the kind I really liked playing for, a spotter team. In this style of play, one member warms up the table with low stakes bets while carefully tracking the cards. Because of the player's $5 and $10 bets, pit bosses and bubble people usually do not recognize that he or she is counting. When enough cards have been played and the odds at the table turn against the house, the spotter signals the big player or jumper, who then joins the game. As the spotter leaves the table, he or she passes the count to the jumper, usually with a prearranged verbal signal, a kind of code, something like a random comment to the dealer. I can only play a little while longer. I've got a big meeting with 15 buyers tomorrow. That means the count is plus 15. Now, with the count favoring the player, the jumper sits down, immediately starts betting the big chips, and if all goes well, cleans up. The team that was scouting me had lost their leader, who had been caught and banned from a lot of casinos. Now they were looking for a new leader. Boss had recommended me, and the scouts liked what they saw. He said this team is one of the best in the world and that I could make a lot of money if I joined. I told Karen. He's going to call me tomorrow and tell me when we start. I'm going to be making over $500,000 a year. Karen jumped up and we danced around the room celebrating. When I neared the hotel room window, I could see the hotel pool glowing blue in the early morning darkness many floors below. That gave me an idea. I turned back to Karen. Do you remember that scene in the movie Vacation where they jumped in the pool? Her face lit up with a smile. Minutes later, we were poolside and the place was deserted. Right before we jumped in, I pulled the $14,000 out and threw it up in the air. Later that morning, I woke up back in the room wondering if I had dreamt all that. But when I looked around, all I could see was 140 still limp $100 bills drying all over the room. With my foam composition and shredding issues settled, I now needed pillow ticks, the covers that hold the fill. At first, this was a bit of a comedy show. Instead of laying out the money to hire a professional to sew them, I invested the money in an industrial sewing machine. Each tick required just a few lines of seaming, and I'd already re engineered the hammer mill. How hard could it be? Hard. That's how. The machine seemed to have 1,000 tiny parts with movements that made about as much sense to me as a cuckoo clock. Charlie and I looked through the manual, which didn't even show how to thread the bobbin. The first time I hit the foot pedal, the thing went nuts, tangling the thread into a mess the size of a baseball. But it did thread the bobbin automatically. It took me a week to sew 300 ticks using a fabric I'd bought at Rochford. It was embossed with tiny stars. By now, I needed a space for the hammer mill and production, so I rented an old bus shed across the street from my house. The landlord, Dick Lenzen, had also sold Karen and me our first house. The kids helped me stuff the new ticks with the pillow fill. We labeled them with Heather's logo, sealed them in plastic, and stacked them in the bus shed. After months of dreaming, brainstorming, and jerry rigging, we had our first 300 pillows ready to go. Now I had just one thing left to figure out: how to get people to buy them. It wasn't long before I got some terrible news. The card counting team Voss had recruited me for had disbanded. All of its members had been caught and barred from casinos. I got the word the same week I was going to join them. Voss tried to console me. "I have another team we can put together," he said, naming my brother Corey and two guys I didn't know, Jim Furlong and Nick Callahan. I didn't feel any better. I predicted I'd make peanuts compared to what I would have made on the other team. Jim was tall and a little cranky at times. He was an excellent player, though. So good he had been making a living at it for about a year by the time we met. He did have one dangerous run in after leaving Grand Casino in Hinckley, Minnesota, though. Jim had cleaned up that night, winning about $9,000, but a guy who'd watched him cash out followed Jim's car down a foggy back road, ran him down, ran him onto the gravel shoulder, put a shotgun in his face, and robbed him. Nick Callahan, a shorter, stockier guy, was a great counter too, but he was also very conservative and seemed to be in it more for the adventure than to make money. Jim would get irritated with him for not betting enough. Even when the count was in his favor, Nick would rarely pass his bets beyond laying another $5 chip on the table. Jim called him $5 Nick. My brother Corey, who had also taken Voss's class, joined us, making a team of four. Corey was slow and very precise. His plodding pace drove me nuts, but it actually helped our act. Together, we traveled to casinos in Mississippi, Nevada, Wisconsin, Washington, and Minnesota. I was basically the team leader, although decision making, such as where we were going to play and what method we were going to use, was a shared responsibility. Because of the cloak and dagger element, like pretending we didn't know each other, team play was more fun than solo counting, which, as I've said, is pretty much a grind. It also took the pressure off financially. Having multiple players on a team tends to overcome deviations, statistical anomalies that cause you to lose when you should be winning. Sometimes that 1.5% advantage that counters have over the house doesn't pan out. With team play, if I'm losing $50 every hand, but Jim, Nick, and Corey are winning at $50 a hand, then we're still netting $100 a hand as a team. Another good thing about team counting was this. With the other guys counting on me, I stuck to the matrices and kept a tighter rein on my inclination to gamble. Between counting trips, I tried to figure out how to sell my product. Eager but naive, I stopped first at the Bed Bath& and Beyond store in Bloomington, where I had started my pillow, where I, where I had started my pillow research. With a sample pillow under one arm, I marched up to the manager. I have the best pillow ever made. You're going to want this in your store, I said. How many would you like? The manager burst out laughing. Sir, I don't decide what we sell. I just work here. I'm sorry, sir, he interrupted. We're a part of a chain, and it has only one buyer for the entire country. You can't just walk in here and see him. He isn't here. As you can imagine, every chain retail store I visited gave me a version of the same message. The rest said something like, why would we buy a pillow from some guy off the street? Sometimes I got so passionate that a manager would say, you need to leave now. My sister's brother in law, Brad, suggested that I sell my pillow from a kiosk. I told him I didn't even know how to spell kiosk. Brad then said he knew of a guy who could get me on the QVC shopping channel. He set up a meeting with the rep who, when I arrived, sat behind a desk wearing a suit and an attitude. The rep told me not so subtly that my product was a joke. I told him I had already given away a lot of sample pillows and everyone loved them. Then I walked out, glad the guy didn't want to sell my product because I didn't want to do business with him anyway. When I ran into the guy years later, he was still wearing a suit, but definitely had a different attitude about my pillow. Never one to give up, I decided to try Brad's kiosk idea at a mall show in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. It was December 2004. I paid $1,000 to be in the show when the exhibitor fee was really only $100. The show manager later admitted he gouged me because he thought I was fly by night, which of course I was. I designed a show booth, stenciling signs and using markers to color in letters. Not only was the whole thing really hokey, but I realized immediately that I had created my own worst nightmare. Having no bar or beer taps between me and the customers left me absolutely terrified. Every ordinary question from a potential buyer felt like a CIA interrogation. On the first day, Karen and I talked our heads off for 4 hours until finally some guy came up and bought a pillow. He also asked me for a business card in case he wanted his money back. I didn't have a business card, so I scribbled my number on a scrap of paper. Like I said, hokey. As soon as he walked away, we both exploded with excitement. We had just sold our first My Pillow. Still, by the time the show was over, we had sold a whopping total of 12 pillows at a loss at a loss of around $1,300, including the inflated entry fee. Several weeks passed, and I was out of ideas. I had more than 250 pillows that cost about $8,000 to make, and I had no place to sell them. For Christmas that year, I had to borrow money from a friend to buy presents for the kids. New Year's Day came and went. Then, one day in January 2005, I was racking my brain for a solution when my cell phone rang. Are you the guy who invented this? Are you the guy? Are you the guy who? Are you the guy who invented this My Pillow? A man said when I picked up. Yeah. Well, I bought one from you at the Eden Prairie kiosk, he said. This is the best product I've ever purchased. I noticed that he didn't say best pillow. He said best product. Seriously? Seriously, he continued. This pillow changed my life. It turned out that the caller was a key organizer at the Minneapolis Home and Garden Show, and he wanted my pillow to be an exhibitor there. My heart did a flip. Tens of thousands of people attended that show. I told him I'd love to participate. We exchanged we, we exchanged details and hung up. Then it hit me. He was the guy who had asked for my business card in case he wanted his money back. The Eden Prairie show had been a huge failure, and this is the guy who gets my phone number? What are the odds?